You guys showed me a lot of love in my recent 1440p 240Hz reviews, and that is the ones that I had from BenQ, Samsung and Alienware. Now the monitor we have in question today is also a similar spec monitor. It is the Gigabyte Aorus FI27Q-X. Now the monitor fluctuates in price, but at the time of making this video it is significantly more expensive than the Samsung counterpart, but is slightly less expensive than the likes of the Dell Alienware. So depending on where you live, you might want to consider this when it comes to purchasing, or indeed just looking for the price fluctuations, almost like the stock market. Now in this review we're going to be seeing if it's worth it and if it's something that I would consider buying myself as someone who's reviewed over 180 monitors and has played over 2,000 hours of competitive Counter-Strike. So jumping straight into it, we're going to talk about its gaming performance. And here the monitor does an extremely good job. Now I'm someone who's played a lot of competitive Counter-Strike, and in this respect this monitor really will suffice for playing competitive games, be it at the top level or let's say at a lower level on competitive games. Now here the monitor's response time is by far one of its most impressive traits, and that's because you can dial its overdrive to pretty much the maximum setting without having to incur too much inverse ghosting. The same couldn't be said about its Alienware rival. However, when it comes to the Samsung, here the Samsung Odyssey G7 does a slightly better job on the whole in terms of response time, and again gives you just that slight bit less of inverse ghosting. Now as for input lag, which is equally as important, if not sometimes a bit more important, because it gives you that kind of feel and how responsive the monitor is to your inputs, in other words your mouse clicks, and here the monitor does an extremely great job. It doesn't, however, have a built-in G-Sync module, and as a result it can't quite give you that extremely low input lag that the Dell Alienware can. However, in comparison to the Samsung Odyssey G7, I think it's pretty much on par. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that if you're a hardcore competitive gamer, you'll definitely appreciate the responsiveness and the input lag of this monitor. And of course, given the fact that it's a 240Hz monitor, you do also get more frames to play around with. Is it something that you are going to require or actually going to need if you're playing at a top level of, let's say, Counter-Strike or any competitive games? Well, that's for you to decide. I've done a detailed breakdown between 60Hz, 144Hz and 240Hz, so definitely do check out that video. It'll be linked in the description below. Now before moving on, I should also reference aim stabilizer, which is effectively like a blur reduction. And in this respect, I do find that when you do enable it, it does add to the overall inverse ghosting of the monitor. As I mentioned before, the inverse ghosting is perfectly acceptable. Now here, unfortunately, for those people who are going to be playing more graphically intense games, so let's say for example Valorant, which is also a competitive game but it's a little bit more visually appealing than the potato looking Counter-Strike, here you will notice a little bit more inverse ghosting to the point where it might actually throw you off and make you feel a little bit, not say dizzy, but a little bit odd when it comes to taking some shots. So as a result, it really depends in terms of your use case, but in this respect the monitor isn't as impressive as the likes of the Samsung Odyssey G7, which does a far better job in terms of handling motion blur, indeed when you enable it, or let's say if you were to disable it altogether. Now I did reference the G-Sync module, and indeed it does not have one built in. So as a result, it means that, well, you have to run it in certain setups if you're wanting to run NVIDIA G-Sync on an NVIDIA graphics card. In my case, I had no problems doing so. I have an RTX 2080 Super, and connected over DisplayPort, not only was I able to run the Pendulum demo without no real issues, but I was also able to run Destiny 2 at 1440p, 240Hz, with G-Sync and HDR all simultaneously running without any flickering issues to note. So again, your mileage may vary, but this is of course my experience that I'm sharing across this video. Now as for HDR, the monitor has a peak brightness of around 480 nits, which is great and therefore surpasses what the manufacturer claims, but unfortunately won't compete with the likes of the Alienware or the Samsung equivalent. That's because these monitors hit over HDR 600 and therefore get the HDR 600 certification, and means that HDR games will just look all that better. That's not quite the case with the Gigabyte, and don't get me wrong, it does look perfectly nice playing, you know, Destiny 2 with HDR enabled versus it disabled, but I just don't think it adds too much to the game, pun intended. In this respect, if you're looking for HDR performance, consider its rivals instead. Very much on that notion, the monitor also does accept a 4K signal. Why is this important? Well, for those people who are going to be gaming alongside their PC rig and playing on console, this monitor can accept that 4K signal and therefore can run at 60 Hz, for example. The reason this might be important is because people might be wanting to run different setups, but I would never buy this monitor if you're purely a console gamer, and likewise any 240 Hz monitor, because, well, a console cannot output more than 120 Hz in the first place, and let alone if you're running a 4K signal, more often than not, you'll be actually limited to 60 Hz. Now, with the gaming section out of the way, let's get on to image quality. Now, first off, I should mention in terms of its pixel layout, this is a little bit different from its counterparts, and this is the reason kind of why I'm mentioning it. I've also seen quite a lot of flack for it online. Now, instead of running an RGB layout, it's running the BGR layout, so it's kind of like a flipped layout, and as a result means that certain text might not look as clear, depending on your operating system, depending on what's being outputted and how your text is being shown. In my case, I run Windows 10, and as a result I can very easily switch the pixel layout by going via the clear type. I think it's clear type, but anyway, you go via the settings and you can adjust that layout. And furthermore, as someone who actually does a lot of typing and writing and indeed reading, I had no issues whatsoever looking at this monitor. I see a lot of hate for it online because of its pixel layout, and quite frankly I think that's just kind of scaremongering people who might not understand what this actually does. So your mileage may vary, but I'm just sharing my experiences in this domain. Now, with that in mind, when I put this monitor in its sRGB mode, which is potentially a little bit ironic, but anyway, it's slightly different between RGB and sRGB, I guess, but put it in sRGB mode, I was actually outstanding at the results I got from this monitor. Now, as you'll be able to see, the gamut coverage, that's 97.3% and 101.1% in gamut volume. It perfectly hits the box, as you might expect, and here the color accuracy is a staggering average delta of 0.81 with a maximum of 3.35, with a contrast ratio that's sitting at around 970 to 1. Effectively, this monitor can be used for professional work, in other words, image editing or video grading, because in its sRGB mode, it's absolutely outstanding. However, this mode doesn't give you the same sort of popping eye candy that some people might come to expect, specifically from a monitor that has a wide color gamut. And as a result, I would suggest putting it on its standard mode if you are not going to be doing any sort of professional work on it, and instead, indeed, if you're going to be playing some games on it. Now here, in terms of its standard mode, you can see that it's quite staggering that it hits the gamut coverage and gamut volumes across the board in sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3, far exceeding the sRGB kind of color gamut, and makes it very impressive in this domain. However, its color accuracy against the sRGB profile is pretty shocking at an average delta of 3.96 and a maximum of 10.96, with a contrast ratio tested at 920 to 1. Effectively, all I'm trying to say over here is that if you're a gamer and you don't care about the pinpoint color accuracy specifically in comparison to the sRGB color gamut, then shove it on standard mode. If you're going to be doing any sort of image editing or any sort of professional work, put it into sRGB mode, and the fact that you can quickly flick through it on the OSD makes it very convenient. Now, before jumping into the OSD, I should talk about peak brightness, brightness uniformity and backlight bleed. Now here, in terms of its minimum brightness, it gets to around 44 nits, whilst the maximum is around 474 nits. Now, if you were to enable aim stabilizer, this will effectively bring down the brightness to around 190 nits and get it locked as well. So depending if you want to use it or not. Now, as for its brightness uniformity, it is bit panel lottery. Mine did okay across the board. However, in terms of backlight bleed, you'll be able to see that it does suffer a little bit of backlight bleed, and as a result, given it's an IPS panel, it's to be accepted. It just won't compete in this domain with the likes of a VA or, for example, a TN panel from Samsung or BenQ respectively. So now we get onto the monitor's OSD, and there's a few options over here that you will recognize from what I referenced before. Now in my case, as I mentioned, using it on speed on overdrive is suggested, and if you're a competitive gamer I would disable AMD FreeSync altogether, just because you don't cap your frames. Now as for the picture modes, there's the standard and sRGB mode as I talked about. In my case I would use standard if I'm not going to be doing any image editing, and I'd use it on the color temperature normal. There's also a few other settings over here you can play around with. The most important potential one would be also sharpness, which you might want to dial to 6 to give you just that little bit of better sharpness when it comes to reading text. Now as for its inputs, it's got HDMI and display ports, so it's HDMI 2.0 and DisplayPort 1.4, and then you've got the RGB range that you can adjust, and for the PIP and PBB mode it does support it. And as for the system, it has the RGB LEDs which you can enable or disable, and we'll talk about this very shortly. And as for the headphone jack, it does have a headphone jack, but it does not have built-in speakers, so something that you should be mindful of. I don't think a built-in speaker is useful for anyone who is going to be playing competitive games, but nevertheless I just thought to mention it. And then you've got a few different options over here, and it's nice to see that you can actually disable the LED indicator which is positioned at the front of the monitor. You can save your settings as well and then reset them all together too. Now elsewhere you do have this dashboard menu which you can access by going on left on the joystick, and you can enable it or disable it depending on if you're going to be using it or not. In my case it doesn't actually work in terms of showing me the CPU temperature, frequency and all that stuff, but of course you might actually like it and therefore might use it. But anyway, for me it's not something I would use. Now very much on that note, there's also Game Assist, which if you go right on the joystick button you can see a few different options over here. Again, these are nothing that I would use myself, but of course I can see some people using them, specifically let's say on the crosshair. I know some people use them, and the display alignment might be useful, but I think that won't be an issue if you're running on Windows. Now aside from the physical OSD, you do also have some software that you can use, and you will want to be connected over your USB Type A to Type B connection. Now first off, RGB Fusion allows you to adjust the RGB lights found at the back of the monitor. I personally don't see a point in them, and I usually disable them altogether, and I'll never get such an app, but of course you might actually really like it, so your mileage may vary. Now what is very good is the OSD Sidekick, which is very much a complementary piece to the hardware OSD, and it allows you to customize and visually see all your settings. It's extremely detailed, and I've been very impressed in the past with the Aorus system over here, and it's, well, just the same that could be said with the OSD Sidekick that's found on this monitor. Now here you can see there's a variety of different things, from your general settings to your display settings, and even you've got the microphone controls, which as far as I'm aware you cannot find via your hardware OSD. So if this is a feature that you are going to be using, then you'll want to get this, this part of the software. So on the whole over here in terms of OSD, very impressive, and something that definitely does stand out in comparison to some of its competitors. And finally we get onto build quality and design, and here the monitor has a three-sided borderless design, and therefore means takes a little bit less real estate on your desk. It's a 27-inch monitor in case you're wondering. Now as for the stand, it's very sturdy, it's not too large either, it fits on my IKEA threaded desk, and in this respect also gives you full amount of adjustments. You can give it height, tilt, swivel or rotation, and effectively gives you all those adjustments that you might crave. I think most people, when they set their monitor in their set place, they're not going to really move it all that much, but it's great to see that Gigabyte have included this amount of adjustments. Now there are some fancy RGB lights as well, which I did reference before, and frankly I just think they're just completely pointless. I can see why RGB lights might be of importance, specifically for a likes of a company like Gigabyte, who offer other peripherals and indeed components, and therefore allows you to potentially synchronize your RGB experience, but and given that they're at the back of the monitor, you're never going to see them, and they're not bright enough for you to have kind of like, let's say, a Philips Hue kind of effect. So I just think they're a little bit pointless, but hey, they're there if you want to use them. And so this all really leads me on to my verdict, and here the monitor does well across the board. I like the fact that it has a dedicated sRGB mode. It accepts a 4K signal for console gamers. It's perfectly responsive and has got a good input lag. It's really well built, and the OSD is really comprehensive, and the fact that you've got the software and hardware ability to customize your settings is going to be appreciated by certain people out there. However, the thing you should consider is that it comes in at roughly the same price as the Dell Alienware, and despite this fact doesn't have the same sort of low input lag because it doesn't have a built-in G-Sync module, and therefore also doesn't have the large array of VR range that the Alienware can offer in comparison to the Gigabyte. And furthermore, it doesn't have HDR 600 certification, where this is limited to HDR 400, and therefore means if you're playing HDR games, you're just not going to get that bettered experience. Now, if you put the Alienware to a side and look at the Odyssey G7, which at the time making this video is significantly cheaper than this Gigabyte, then you're getting a curved monitor that has far better contrast ratio and a better ability at dealing with motion blur. It's also HDR 600 certified, has got a decent input lag and response time which will pretty much go toe-to-toe with this Gigabyte, and effectively is a great pick as well. So my personal suggestions would be to go for the Alienware if you want that IPS panel. If, however, you want a little bit more of a washed out color and you want all the bells and whistles as well, go for the Samsung equivalent. I just can't see myself recommending this monitor at this price point, specifically when you consider its alternatives offer a bettered experience. But of course, that's just my independent, honest opinion about the monitor. If you do appreciate that, then do consider liking the video and of course subscribing. And if you feel this video will be helpful to a family and friend, feel free to share this video with them, as it would be greatly appreciated. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.